My name is Susan Njai, and I'm the community horticulture educator. And with us today, we have Cecile Jones and Sally Nielsen, two of our Master Gardener volunteers. Today's topic is winter damage on plants. So we'll be going through some topics, and then if you have any questions at the end, we'll take questions. So our first question is about salt damage. So, I live in a housing development where the grounds crew uses a lot of salt in the winter. As a result, there's extensive damage to my landscape plants. What can I do to mitigate this issue? And are there any plants that are resistant to salt damage? So here we have a picture of salt damage. So salt damage appears at the bottom of these plants. These are yews, which are extremely susceptible to salt damage. So if you have yews and there's salt anywhere near them, they'll definitely show injury. But other things that you can see in this picture, this is a juniper, but usually salt damage you're going to see more prevalent on the side facing the road or sidewalk. The salt damage can be from spray, and it can also be the salt that dissolves into the soil. And you'll see browning and discoloration of the leaves or needles. It starts at the tip. If it's a needle, it starts or a leaf, and it works its way inwards. You can also see bud damage and death, twig and stem dieback, as well as just reduced plant vigor. Sometimes it takes a while for the salt to accumulate in the soil. So maybe you put a new plant in, you don't see any issues, but then a few years later, it's right next to the sidewalk. All that salt has accumulated and you start seeing issues. How do we prevent this? How can we prevent salt damage? Well, I know salt is a very common de-icing agent used. For example, you are at a place where you don't have say what is used. Can't really help this, but there are non-sodium and they're also not salt-free de-icing agents. So there's quite a list of them. When we send out the video, we'll send out a resource which actually has the cost of them and a whole list of them. But some of them that are sodium-free are calcium chloride and calcium and magnesium acetate, also known as CMA. And then some salt-free, there's sand, but also limestone-based ones and acetic acid-based de-icing agent. Also, if as salt spray is a big issue. If you have really sensitive plants near the road, you can always cover them with burlap, that especially if they're very sensitive, that will prevent the spray. That won't prevent, the salt that dissolves into the ground, but it will prevent the damage from the spray. And then planting salt-tolerant plants. There are quite a few tolerant plants, and when this video is posted, I'll send a whole list of them. Just because they're tolerant doesn't mean they're going to be affected. It depends on the amount of salt. Everything will eventually be affected. And then there are some corrective messages that you can do, right? So if you're worried there's a lot of salt on the sidewalk near your plants, before the spring growth, if you go through and you really water thoroughly, so you want to do thorough and repeated watering, and that will leach out the salt, the sodium and the chloride. And that has to be before the plant starts growing. That's when it's going to be doing a lot of that uptake of nutrients from the soil. After the spring thaw, but before growth, you just want to do some repeated waterings. And then if there is damage, there's really not much you can do except pruning it out. You want to prune out that damage because it's not going to fix itself. If you want to know when to prune, we have a pruning class coming up. And now we have Sally, and she's going to talk a little about desiccation.
Hey, everyone. So another question that we frequently get asked is, should I water my plants in the winter? And the answer is yes, you should water your plants. Plants require water all year long. And if you're experiencing periods of drought, you can experience it even in the winter with not enough rain or snowfall. And desiccation, it's basically a state of severe dryness. And some of the things that you're going to see due to this severe dryness is on your broadleaf evergreens, you're going to see browning or yellowing of the leaves. You're going to see leaf curling. And this is some of the symptoms. On your conifers, you're going to see yellowing or browning of the leaves. This tree actually has some severe damage. I'm not even sure it could be turned around with watering. Sometimes, especially on the conifers, by the time you start noticing something like this, it's too late. The question is, how do we prevent desiccation? So you want to make sure you're not pruning your trees and shrubs at the wrong time. Don't prune them in the fall. And also where you plant your shrubs is important. If your shrubs are facing southwest or south, they're exposed to a lot more sun and wind, which causes a lot of evaporation of moisture through the leaves. So plant your conifers and your evergreens north and northeast sides of the building. If we're not getting rain, make sure you do water. You want to water when the temperature is above 40 degrees, though, of course, because you can't water a frozen ground. But you can also wrap your plants in burlap and make sure your ground is mulched really, really well. That will hold in moisture also. And then they also do make an anti-desiccant spray. You would use this late in the season, early winter. I would say December would probably be about the best time to apply this. You don't want to apply it too early in the season. So late December, around when the temperature is 40 to 50 degrees, and you want to make sure there's no rainfall in the forecast. You want to spray your leaves thoroughly, tops and bottoms. Make sure you follow your instructions on your label, though, very carefully. Always read your label. And this spray cannot be put on your blue spruces, your blue conifers, your waxy conifers, because this will damage the needles and turn them a different color. The desiccation spray just basically forms a waxing coating on top of your leaves. But should you get this damage to your trees and shrubs, about the only corrective measure you can do is basically pruning it out. Or if it's a small tree or shrub, consider moving it to a better place. So right place, right plant.
Thanks, Sally. And now we're going to have Cecile, and she's going to talk a little about damage to boxwood, a common thing seen here in Orange County.
We have question number 3. The question is, last spring, several of my boxwoods turned yellow. I was told this was winter injury. What happened? How do I protect them? Before we go to the next slide, I just want to point out that image. Top half is yellowish and brownish. And also notice that the boxwoods are in a wide open area where there's, it looks like a street or a sidewalk on the left and more sidewalk on the right. So it's like out in the open. So what's happening with these boxwood? Well, before we can fix the problem, we may have to make sure that we have the correct diagnosis, because then you'll be off on the wrong track. Some possible things that could happen to boxwoods are boxwood blight, which is kind of sad because it's a fungal pathogen. And what will happen is pretty serious to the boxwood. I'll show you in the pictures in the next slide. You could also have the boxwood leaf miner, which is a mosquito-like fly. And what it does is it lays its larvae in the leaf cells. And when it comes out, there'll be a little exit hole in the leaf. Or it could be winter injury, such as desiccation or drought stress. And the following slide shows you the pictures. On the left, you have the boxwood blight. See the blotches over there on the leaves? That's a fungal infestation. And what will happen is it will quickly defoliate the plant, and the leaves will drop rather drastically. If there are other boxwoods next to it, it'll spread rather quickly, and there's really just no hope for it. On the leaf miner, you can see that there are blotches in the leaf. You would have to look up close because the leaves are pretty small. And you have to turn it over, you'll see a little exit hole where that larvae came out. And lastly, you have winter injury, where the top half of the plant is kind of brownish, yellowish, and rather dried out. So what causes this winter injury? Where there are a lot of stress factors that could cause that kind of drought stress. First of all, is this boxwood in the right place? Meaning, is the soil correct for this plant? If it's very acidic, this boxwood is not going to be really happy and will get stressed out. If the soil is not properly drained, again, this boxwood will be stressed out and will be more susceptible to winter damage. If it's getting all day sun, boxwoods don't like that. They like maybe 3 to 4 hours of sun, and then in the afternoon, maybe dappled shade. And they like to be kind of protected from extreme wind and harsh winds, like near a building as opposed to out in the open. And also they do like quite a bit of water, but they don't want to have wet feet. So make sure you're watering a plant properly. Or if it's planted too deeply, that'll also affect the boxwood. Or if it's not properly mulched, you don't have enough mulch to retain the moisture and to help retain the heat, that will stress out the boxwood and make it more susceptible to winter damage. So what can you do about this damage? So you have to water thoroughly throughout the year. As Sally said, even though it's starting to get cold, as long as the temperatures are above 40, you really should be watering your plants so that they don't get too dry. Don't forget about the mulch. You want at least a 3-inch layer of mulch, but you don't want the mulch so close to the ground that it'll choke the plant. So give it some space. You could also spray the leaves with an anti-desiccant, or you could cover it with burlap to protect it from the harsh winter winds. And like Sally said, don't prune after August because it's too late in the season. The pruning will encourage your plant to set out new buds, They won't have time to acclimate and grow. Corrective measure, really, there's nothing you can do. If it's a drought stress, you just have to prune judiciously.
Thanks, Cecile. And now we're going to talk a little bit about sunscald and frost cracking. The question is, a few years ago, I planted a honey locust in my backyard. I noticed that the south side of the trunk is peeling and cracking. What caused this and how can I protect it? So here is a picture of that honey locust, and you can see that the bark looks awful. There's some bark missing. It's kind of peeling off of it. Let's talk about what causes that. Sunscald and frost cracking, they're kind of similar in nature, and sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they're caused by extreme temperature fluctuations. Something that we've seen here, right? It was 7 degrees on Christmas Day, and today it's raining in almost 50. And so sunscald is when that temperature drops quickly, it damages basically the bark and the layer beneath of it, the cambium, which is where the tree grows from. And then a frost cracking is when there's tension between the frozen layers of wood and the unfrozen. So under the bark is frozen wood, and when that freezes and then the sun comes out and warms up the bark, you know, it's expanding, but it's not going to be able to expand because it's frozen behind it, and that causes that cracking. And frost cracking also is more common when there's already some injury to the tree. You know, if you're hitting the tree with your mower, or, you know, you've damaged a tree in some sort, you're more likely to get frost cracks. Here are some great pictures of frost cracking and sunscald. You can see some of them. You know, this one is healed over. This one is on a Norway maple. It's elongated, it's sunken, it's dried, there's dead bark. And this is on a sugar maple. Usually you're going to see this damage on the southwest side of the tree. That's where it's getting the sun, where there's going to be that change in temperature between the cold frozen wood and then the warmer outer. So how can you prevent a frost cracking? Well, using a white trunk guard. So here's 2 examples of trunk guards. This one is more of like a tube that expands, and this one is actually wrapped around the tree. So you want to wrap a newly planted trees for at least the first 2 winters, and then thinly barked ones like the honey locust and the maple, you're going to want to do for at least five winters, because they're more susceptible. It takes a while for the bark to get thicker, and because once the bark is thicker, it's insulating, right? It has that insulating method, so you don't have to worry about it as much. And then you do want to make sure that you remove it in the spring. Here is a picture that was sent to our helpline of someone who did not remove it, and you can see that the tree was growing, and the bark kind of started, you know, finding its way through, pushing through the wrap. You don't want to put it on the tree until kind of probably December, and then you want to take it off in this before the tree starts, you know, putting on new growth. So if you do have some sunscald and frost cracking, what can you do? Well, usually, luckily, trees heal themselves. Trees are, you know, plants are pretty amazing things, and they're pretty good at healing themselves. But if necessary, to take measures, use a sterilized sharp knife. You don't want to be spreading germs into the tree. You know, just like when a doctor is working on you, they use sterilized equipment. When you're working on a plant, you want to also use sterilized equipment. So what you're going to do is you're going to follow the general shape of the wound and remove the dead bark until you found some live tissue. And then do not cover the wound. You know, in the past, it has been suggested that there's, you know, paint that you can put over it or wrapping it. And what they found, research says that, in fact, it's better if you just leave it open. Putting things on it actually prevents proper healing. And now Cecile's going to talk about frost heaving.
The question is, every spring I notice that some of my perennials have been raised up out of the soil. What causes this, and how can I prevent this? So what they have here, and the next slide, is just frost heaving. What happens is when you have a frequent fluctuation of above freezing and then below freezing, or freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing, it makes the soil expand and contract and on until it pushes out the plant, and it exposes the soil surface after it thaws repeatedly. Symptoms: plants are lifted or heaved, as the name implies. And when that happens, it could break the roots of the plant. It could expose the roots and the crown to winter elements, to the cold and snow, and it could damage the crown and the roots, thereby affecting the growth of the plant. So to prevent it, make sure that you're mulching your bare soil around the plant correctly. About 3 inches is good. Remember not to choke the plant, give it some space from the ground. And I would periodically walk around the garden to check if there's frost heaving. That way you can do corrective measures right away. If you don't do the inspections, then it could have been a long time before you see it, and then it might be too late.
All right, and now we're going to talk about, you know, what's on everyone's mind here in Orange County: deer damage.
The question that we get often asked is, how can I stop the deer from eating my plants? And unfortunately, there are not a lot of solutions. We had a couple examples of the deer damage. Basically, the deer are eating your shrubs. And on the tree on the right, you can see how the deer have eaten the bottom of that tree. As far as they can reach, as far as their heads can go up, they're eating that tree. The next slide is showing an example of antler rub, where they're rubbing their antlers against the tree trunk and they've totally destroyed the tree trunk. The tree will not survive that. And the other picture also is the feeding of the deer on that tree all the way up as far as they can reach. The main solution to this is prevention, and it's basically physical barriers. The deer can jump extremely high. So if you're doing a physical barrier, it should be at least 8 feet high, if not higher. They do make repellents, but the repellents have to be reapplied frequently. And if it rains, you have to reapply them. You can try using deer-resistant plants. There are lists of them. Susan will probably include that. Farmers can certainly apply for nuisance licenses. You cannot shoot deer out of deer season, but farmers or people that can show cause that these animals are a nuisance to their crops and their livelihood can apply for a nuisance license through the DEC, and then they can eliminate the deer any time of year. Whenever you do see damage to any of your vegetation, you need to identify first what is causing the damage. And a lot of damage can be caused by rodents, the voles, the squirrels, chipmunks. They all can do a lot of damage. So you need to identify what's causing the damage. Here are some symptoms. As you can see, vole damage, destroying your lawn, the tree trunk damage down on the bottom, either probably maybe by a woodchuck eating the bark all the way around. And then the chipmunks are also notorious for eating bulbs and digging bulbs out of your gardens, which was a real problem that I had for quite a while. Prevention, again, you want to do your proper mulching. Make sure you've removed also any habitats that may support their little homes. Don't have any shrub or brush piles near your home. Make sure your bird feeders are out away from your home too, because your squirrels and your mice are really going to feed on all that seed that's fallen on the ground. And then the next step is into your house. So keep your bird feeders away from your home. To manage this, a lot of people might think that they want to take the humane route and try to limit their wildlife damage. And they feel like they should trap the wildlife and then move it to somebody else's property. So this is illegal. You have to make sure that you're not able to do this. The best course is to just eliminate the animal, but you have to be careful in the way that you eliminate them. Don't use rodent poison. This is warfare. And even while you might think, okay, I'm eliminating this rodent, this mouse, or whatever, you have to think that when this rodent dies, something else may be eating it. And they will also be exposed to that poison. So you may be inadvertently killing birds or other animals that have eaten the rodent that you've killed with poison.
Thanks so much, Sally. That's what we have for you today. Does anybody have any